Hello, and you're very welcome to Adapt Radio. My name is Dr. Claire O'Connell, and today we will be talking about AI and digital sovereignty.
From the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, this is Adapt Radio, presenting groundbreaking innovations, one conversation at a time.
Digital sovereignty is less about what digital assets a nation state might own or control, but more about avoiding the fact that other actors may own and control you.
As Ireland prepares for its 2026 presidency of the Council of the European Union, a defining question for Europe's digital future is how can we build AI systems that are open, trustworthy and sovereign? Could open source be the key critical digital infrastructure? To discuss this today, we're joined by Claire Dillon of Open Ireland Network and open source leader Sarah Novotny. Claire is a founder of Open Ireland Network and is currently also a PhD researcher in University of Galway with the Lero Research Centre, where she's focusing on researching open collaborative software development practices. And Sarah is open source champion, and she's leading in projects such as Kubernetes, Open Telemetry, NGINX and MySQL. I hope I pronounced those correctly, Sarah. And Sarah is also studying for a Master's in Applied Social Data Science in Trinity College Dublin. Claire and Sarah, you're both very welcome to Adapt Radio.
Thank you for letting us join. Great to be here.
So can I start with a couple of kind of basic terms? What do we mean by digital sovereignty and why is it such an issue now in particular? So Claire, maybe if you want to give that a go?
Well, I mean, this is one of those ones where there are many different potential definitions, and I don't know if anyone's settled on a fast and hard one, but I suppose one of the ways I've heard it described recently, which I particularly like, is that digital sovereignty is less about what digital assets a nation state might own or control, but more about avoiding the fact that other actors may own and control you and your digital assets. So it's really about this idea of resiliency and your ability to affect change and to be resilient in a state of the world where things are changing.
Okay.
So for me, it's more about that adaptability from a national level in terms of what we're relying on within our digital landscape.
Okay, so we have that agency ourselves, not to be over-influenced or over-controlled by external organisations or other nations, etc. That's it.
Indeed,
okay,
yeah.
Fair enough. And Sarah, maybe I can ask you why, might a lack of digital sovereignty, that lack of agency over our own sort of digital things, make a difference to people in their practical day-to-day lives?
Oh, it's such a fun question. In your day-to-day life, everything you do at this point is intermediated by technology. Like if you want to check in on your bank account, you're using some sort of technology, even if it's just calling someone to get a balance, but you're using some amount of technology in this. And everything a government does, every interaction you have with the government is intermediated by some amount of technology. Any conversation you have, this conversation we're having is intermediated by a technology platform. So those control points, when they are not only control points by making things easier for you and me and making it easier for the bank to be able to deliver us the data we need, those control points can also be limiting factors when they are wholly owned and decided and controlled by an entity that is not aligned in the same way as you or your government. This is moderation on social media. You may or may not agree with the choice to remove a post because someone else's values are being exerted upon you. So you have this whole question of technical sovereignty and digital sovereignty. I love the way Claire described this as, it's not about what I necessarily own, but making sure that I have control. I have the ability to evaluate risk, remain resilient within change, and then be able to adapt to the technological changes as they come to me.
And how have the changes in AI over the last maybe, 4 or 5 years affected things like digital sovereignty? Where does AI come into all this?
AI is a further extension of the same problem, and it's a consolidation of power through data, which then that power through data is the way, again, intermediation, the way that you use that data to refine to answers, to give a biased or particular perspective in these answers. So anytime you ask a question of Google, you get an answer that is worked through their corporate lens, worked through their corporate value system, worked through their shareholders' best advantage. So when you now get, the advertisements at the very top of the page instead of the question straight up from the decision, that's a challenge. Now, AI is just an extension of this. It's a new set of technologies that make this perhaps more blatant, definitely more slick, because we give these answers from AI, or we get these answers from AI with great confidence. And we're seeing the same sort of problem just amplified, I think.
Okay. And Claire, did you have something to add there?
I want to add to that because, of course, everything that Sarah just mentioned in terms of things like the actual responses from the AI engine and any of the inherent values or data that's included as a whole set of areas of concern. And then added to that, I would add that what we're seeing now is a huge change, a shift change in terms of our tech landscape. And we're seeing a number of, for example, the foundational models which are coming out, which are concentrating the technology into a few players. And I suppose that also, based on this idea of where our choke points are, limitations are, also presents additional risks when you're thinking about digital sovereignty, because you're thinking about, well, that means that now I'm reliant on a few big players, not just the quality of the responses that they produce for me or the applicability for them for my context versus maybe a different culture or area. But you're also thinking about, well, now I'm building in a dependency, or you might be thinking about building in a dependency on, this other actor. What are the risks if that service stops happening? What are the risks if we now build a lot of our infrastructure, business and social and civil, and suddenly what happens if they decide to put up the price? Now, how do we even plan for that? Because we now have no ability to control the cost of the services we become dependent on. There's a number of additional dependencies and risks that one might be building in if we are now shifting our entire technical landscape to actually be dependent on these new services.
So it's a case of too much power and influence in too few hands. Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and too little agency for folks that are actually becoming dependent on that. So there's a question about a point in time dependency, like what happens if they decided to double the price of everything tomorrow? How would we even handle that? And then there's the longer term idea of, as we build in these dependencies, what do we lose in terms of the various different other technology or even economic systems that we might have built around the alternatives that exist today. So there's loads of things to think about if you're thinking about it from a national level and trying to look at both the immediate term and the future that we're all building towards.
So is this where open source enters the chat, as they say? And if so, can you tell me a little bit about what open source is? I mean, I think I have an idea of what it is, but I'd love to hear your definitions of it. So Sarah, tell me about open source.
So open source is used as a descriptor for a few things. One, it is a licensing model that allows people to use and adapt software. So it's publicly published. You're allowed to downstream make adaptations to it. You can participate in the creation of it, and there are no restrictions on usage. So that's one thing. It is a development model, which is the way this software is created. And that is a process that allows people to have more of a participation aspect in building what they need. And then there is sort of the verb of open sourcing, which is when a company takes a piece of software and makes it public. Now, possibly just by making it public and allowing you to use it, but not necessarily accepting contributions to it. Or possibly we see the misuse of the label open source in a lot of cases right now, because open source requires a set of, say, social contracts. And then there is one organization that defines some particular licenses as truly open source. But open source is often sort of labeled as a marketing gloss. And so when that happens, you aren't necessarily getting the benefits as a consumer of the type of development and the freedom to make changes to the software and examine the software that you would expect. But the companies may be still getting, the company or the organization that's calling something open source may still be getting the marketing privilege because people think they want open source because they recognize that it may be a better way to develop software. And they may be getting even policy privilege because in a lot of different countries, there is a privilege for or an encouragement for governments and organizations to use open source software because there are these benefits. So it's a really interesting spot right now. And maybe, Claire, if you've got any tighter answer to that.
Unfortunately, it's not tighter. I was going to elaborate more about my... So,
go for it.
I mean, I think it's really interesting because I discovered the open source world only in the last number of years. I had not really been aware of, I suppose, the depth and the nuance of what's happening in that ecosystem. So, for example, when I think about why open source has become recently a topic that's so widely discussed, I think about the benefits and I think about the fact that for the most part, I think open source has become so important because it's so easy to use the technology. And I think the whole technology industry has come to realize that when you think about digital transformation or, how we use technology, it's not just about building technology. It's about how easily we can use and adapt technology. Like that's the crux of what makes it impactful. Like digital transformation is not just about building new whizzy things. It's about when it's useful. And I think open source becomes incredibly useful for a number of reasons. One is because developers can download and use it without any friction. You have your license there. Everyone knows what the license is and the freedoms it allows you to actually, be able to use that software without, for example, going through a sales team or purchasing something in that respect. That's incredibly useful for people to be able to download and use things without friction. But more importantly, you can look at things and learn from them. And that ties into the whole idea of trustworthiness, right? So when things are open source and you can actually see what's there, you know what's in the code and therefore can have a better idea for those who want to, can look in and see A, how it's built, B, if there's anything funny going on or if you like what's going on. And in the open source, you can actually even suggest changes like, oh, I like that program, but wouldn't it be better if it did this? I can actually have the agency to change that. And if you tie that back to the previous conversation we had, like that becomes incredibly important when you start building in dependencies on these things. And I suppose that's the other point I just want to make as well, because I've often heard this idea of is it open source or not open source? But like literally almost all of today's software, even if it's proprietary, is mostly open source. So no one builds stuff from scratch anymore and it's completely secret sauce. Like very little in the world's software list is completely proprietary. It's usually up to 90% open source and a tiny sliver of secret sauce, even when it's proprietary. So really, the world's software is open source, most of it. And so, understanding what it is, understanding how that gives more agency can become incredibly important.
Absolutely. And how does Ireland go about doing this? Particularly, we have this presidency for the 6 months of this year, 2026. How do we sort of use that position maybe to highlight the opportunities here, particularly around, as you say, like a lot of open source is out there. Is it a case of capitalizing on that open source in order to create digital sovereignty?
Well, I think it is interesting from a European perspective because the whole area of digital sovereignty has become a much more important topic at a Europe level. So there's many different policies, and Sarah mentioned policy privilege. They are very explicitly building in this idea of open source is good, aligned with the goal of digital sovereignty and, having agency and making sure that Europe is a player in whatever's coming next. And that's where I think the opportunity lies. So one of the things that we haven't explicitly said here, but even if you think about the number of AI models in the world, like there are an awful lot of open source AI models where openness is a priority, where things are not closed and secret. You just don't hear about them as much. Like you hear about the big foundational models, but there are hundreds of thousands of models that are coming from all over the world that people are using in order to have and give themselves more agency and independence, and sometimes to help them control the costs even. Because, by the way, another myth is that open source is free, but you still have to invest in it and run it and all that sort of thing. So it's not free per se as in cash free, but it does give you a lot more control. So people are sometimes choosing it if they want to adapt it or have more control over cost or maybe run it locally. And there are hundreds of thousands of open source models. But think about that and how fast the AI space is moving. If we really want to be effective at that in Europe, it's about understanding that entire landscape, thinking about what to use, how to choose between the hundreds of thousands of options, what are the skills required, how to maybe commercialize some of those offerings. There's so much opportunity there for Europe, for Ireland. A lot of work to be done globally, and we could play our part. That's what I see the opportunity being.
I'll throw another opportunity that you have in here that we collectively, Europe and Ireland, because I'm recently joined in Europe. I moved to Dublin 6 months ago. The opportunity that you have is that there are a lot of technologists who want to work on open source, but have to do it as a side gig, have to do it as their, after dinner, I'll do a little bit. And there are a lot of people that do an amazing amount of work in that capacity. There's also a lot of companies that will support developers who are doing work for them on their behalf in their directional goals, in alignment with their directional goals in these open source projects. But there is an enormous amount of work around the maintenance, the shared responsibility of these dependencies, these building blocks that all of technology is built on. And Europe has an enormous opportunity to say, we can help fund that, and that will lead us to control and direct our destiny, A, by building our skills, B, by attracting talent that may want to not, say, continue in the US model of corporate-led development, and also to further reinforce and build the safety and security of these tools that we are all dependent on.
I love that. I just want to add into that, getting good at doing that together and building bridges, because you hear a lot about this idea of almost national level competition in this new area, and like state X versus state Y and who's going to win in the competition. But fundamentally, open source is a global effort, and there are contributors and users globally. And really, to get to where we need to be, the future of technology, the future of AI, it's about working together. It won't work if someone just decides to do it all by themselves, for themselves. That's never going to work. So if we really want to get to a better place with AI, with technology, we have to work together. Ireland in particular has a history of being good about getting people to work together. We could help that, I think, in terms of just applying that kind of culture of collaboration to the whole world of open source technology and open source AI.
And I suppose, as well as sort of linking different people and countries around the world, what about cross or multidisciplinary research? What kind of, a lot of it, of course, is about the computer science and all that. But what other disciplines need to be brought to bear to make sure that open source helps to create digital sovereignty and in a way that's equitable, fair, and I suppose safe?
There are so many ways that people can contribute in open source projects and how open source contributes to every discipline. So you find in universities that a lot of the software that is developed within different sciences and even within, say, political science, these tools that are being built using computers. Often they're being open sourced. Sometimes they're being open sourced with a broader intent and a big cross-industry or cross-academia collaboration. Sometimes they're just like, hey, I made a cool thing and it's got a license on it, so you're welcome to use it. So we see that sort of work. We also see in the larger, more dependency sort of ecosystem, or the language sort of ecosystem, we see people from across the technology industry contributing, but we also need people that can raise money. We need people that can do marketing of these projects. We need people that can raise awareness and do advocacy of these projects, people who can do project management of these projects, so like across the disciplines of not straight coders. We need lots of people who are interested in supporting and lifting these projects and these tools that are the building blocks that we accelerate innovation on top of.
I'd like to add to that too. I work a lot with individuals in universities who are working on building open source skills. And I think what's really interesting is that they spend a lot of time working with folks like completely outside the computer science department. So, and I think that's a kind of a convergence of what's happening in the technology industry because of the rise of what sometimes has been called vibe coding, or, the idea that AI has also enabled people who are less technical to start becoming a little bit more technical, or at least working with technology in a different way. And I think what's happening is that you're seeing an awful lot of people, just to build on what Sarah was saying, examples of folks that are coming from places like the humanities, folks, all sorts of disciplines, like every single discipline these days often has technology, I suppose, playing a part in how their researcher, if they're a researcher, how their research actually has an impact in society. So people are building apps and people are building models, hearing stories about folks building AI models to help genealogical studies. And these are all, again, you're building something for a very particular domain and a very particular challenge. And the people who are best placed to be involved in that building are the folks with that domain research knowledge, not the technologists. A lot of that's kind of been done for you to some degree. I mean, you do want to think about things like safety and predictability and, good practices from the technical perspective. But unless you've got the domain knowledge in there, like the folks who know that research area, it won't work because you're not going to have the correct context for that problem. That's a huge opportunity because you're broadening out now the number of people who can get involved in this idea of transforming how we do things and building the technology that we will rely on. And again, another form of agency, right? Just bringing more people into the mix. As Sarah mentioned, the benefits that all these people can have on the projects, but it brings the benefits to a much wider set of people. And even things like it helps with that economic divide, because you don't want to have a scenario where you have to pony up the cash in order to get in on this whole AI revolution. You want to have options for people to have cheaper alternatives. You want to have them be able to even explore how to do energy efficient versions of these sorts of things, or bringing AI to the edge and mobile scenarios. Like, there's so many areas we still have to explore. And even the big foundation model companies, even if they have all the billions of dollars that's being invested in them, they'll never get to every context and every domain and every scenario and every region in terms of building what's necessary for people. And if folks want to be able to build what's right for them to solve their problems, then open source is a pathway to get them to be able to do that.
I suppose a lot of the big models, the ones that have the billions behind them, they're often built to serve the many. But as you say, open source creates this opportunity for people to build technology that works in those maybe more nuanced contexts, or maybe for smaller countries, or maybe for things like minority languages that maybe not a lot of people speak them around the world, but they're very important in a particular place and it's important to keep pace. How do you make sure that when you are having these kind of, lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds all working together, how do you make sure that everything does still end up being safe and serving that community well?
Oh, I can spend hours on this one. Okay, so time, we've, right, okay, 2 minutes or less. So there's a number of ways that this works. In very small projects that become, say, accidentally famous, some of these are dependencies that we find in language ecosystems. There are sort of best practices that when you publish a piece of software that you sort of keep track of, as the projects mature, as the projects get larger, as the projects get more impactful, as you get more people collaborating together, there is an entire body of work, set of best practices around governing projects. Now, that's governing the group of people that is, as they work together, as well as governing how the software is developed. And you have different models of that governance in order to make sure that they're done safely, that people who are working on them are, supported in the work that they're doing, that the way that things are released has a remediation plan if there is a flaw in it, So there is an entire body of work, and this is a lot of what I've worked on for large-scale projects for the last 15 years, has been building that governance so that it doesn't matter if you are, who the company is that you might be working for, or if you aren't working for a company directly, but you're contributing, how you earn status, how you follow processes, what those processes are, how things get documented, how all of that works and runs almost as its own sort of It's not a company, it's a community, how it runs as a community and what those best practices and sort of social norms are in order to meet the objectives of the community, which is safe and stable and secure software.
I'll add into that because obviously it is a big topic. People do masters and PhDs on it. But I do think that as well as that, there are also, I suppose, trends that organizations over the last number of years have even built very particular parts of their organizations, for example, open source program offices who specifically look at that sort of thing in a corporate context. And that had been a popular thing. I'm involved in a community that actually do that for the academic world. So Curious community, that's with an OSS at the end. But they work on the idea of how do you actually build those best practices, not just the technical best practices and the governance best practices, but even down to areas of that, the project management, community management, people management that Sarah had talked about earlier in terms of the needs. And I would say there's also tooling emerging. So even if you think again about another, trend in software development, some of this now can be automated as well. So it's not just about every individual learning a whole other set of things that they have to do. But in larger organizations, there's more automation around checking for security vulnerabilities, thinking about building your software bill of materials so you know what your dependencies are and checking the health of those projects. All of these sorts of things can also be automated to some degree. And I think we're beginning to see the beginning of that type of support being made available in public sector institutions and universities as well. But I would say as a whole, the sector in the public sector arena is a little bit behind the corporate sector in looking at how to make that whole process of making things safe better and easier. So it's something that I think, again, is another opportunity.
And I'll add a specific opportunity here. The way vulnerabilities are managed, categorized, classified, and published to the global world has relied for a very long time on the US government and a few organizations within that, something called CVSS programs. And those are under strain right now. And having a counterpart in Europe that managed, categorized, balanced, investigated, researched, and drew from across all of Europe with cybersecurity skills and investments would be an enormous benefit to software all up, but open source particularly in this. The CVE programs are really struggling in the US.
Okay, so there's a big opportunity there. And I suppose, speaking of which, as I say, Ireland has the presidency for the next 6 months. What's achievable in 6 months? What can we do to help to ensure that the open source and the open sourcing is going in the right direction?
I think that there's maybe two areas that I would certainly love to see discussed. And I know there are plans even within the term of the presidency to have some of these kinds of conversations happening in Ireland to bring people together when we're in that role. But I think one thing is just kind of giving more clarity about what we want to see happen with regard to this and why. So that'd be kind of coming into policies and guidelines. I mean, there's lots of discussion around that. But there has been a lot of discussion about this in the past. I would love to see it go beyond that. So I think we still need to have that because not everyone's on board. But I also would love to get down to the nitty-gritty of how do we do this together? Because we're not getting there. And I think an awful lot of the vehicles that are currently available for collaboration and for even doing the very particular things like Sarah mentioned, like they're just not clear about how Ireland can make those things happen within or anyone, any actor, any national actor could do it. And everything in Europe to date has been quite possibly necessarily slow if you're talking about bringing things into regulation and all the rest of it. But the world is not moving at that pace anymore. So if we really want to be impactful in Ireland, in Europe, we need alternative ways to make things happen quicker. So I would say the opportunity that I would love to see happen is talk about the why and the how, and then get down to that nitty gritty about the how. I'm talking about level of detail of, does this mean we have to all get in the same room or can we do this virtually? How often do we have to meet? Does it require travel budget? Can we do this how do we build the communities of the right people with the right skills? Like literally, what do we start in the next few months that will make this happen? Rather than a wish list of, wouldn't it be nice if we had these things in a few years,
yes.
Which we know we never get to.
And Sarah?
I would say to complement what Claire said, because I think that is super important. One of the ways that governments signal is by attaching money to things. So getting money attached to Claire's concrete plans, even if they're just the start of we're going in this direction, but getting concrete money, allocated over the next N years, concrete money attached to this work is a thing that needs to get it actually moving.
And that's hard because it sounds like it's a thing that one can do because we know that there's so much investment happening in AI. But because so much of the investment in AI is going towards building stuff from the ground up, and because the need is so large, like carving off a piece of that investment for work like this that is both necessary and important and urgent, but isn't like your traditional hard infrastructure, it can be difficult for people to do that, but it would be an amazing outcome. Yeah.
But it is the traditional hard infrastructure of software. If we're looking at dependency management, if we're looking at dependency security, which we've determined is a lot of the open source underlayer.
Well, it's an area that we will watch with huge interest over the next 6 months. And thank you to Claire Dillon and Sarah Novotny for joining us today on Adapt Radio.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks all.
If you would like to find out more about Adapt's work in this area, do visit www.adaptcentre.ie or check out the show notes. For now, though, until next time, from me, Dr. Claire O'Connell, Slán, and thanks for listening.
The Adapt Radio podcast is brought to you by the Adapt Centre at Trinity College, Dublin. Find out more about their extensive research work at adaptcentre.ie. Join us next time to hear about more groundbreaking innovations. To get new episodes automatically, just click the follow button on your player right now. The Adapt Radio podcast is produced by dustpod.io with episodes monthly on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts.